Hello, I hope everyone listening who is part of the Night Tales community is doing well. I've been watching for a while and finally decided to share one of the most intense experiences I've had. During university, I had to work to afford my studies in literature. And, well, given the nature of the degree, I also had to continue with jobs unrelated to my field until I finally found something related to my studies. The job I held the longest, thanks to an opportunity provided by a friend of my father's who recommended me, was as a night watchman. Technically, I was part of a private security service, but since they knew I was studying, they didn't change my shifts during my time there. Obviously, the night shift suited me best, so I ended up guarding old warehouses, a hotel under renovation, hospitals, and even cemeteries. During the nearly 3 years I did this job, several things happened that I couldn't explain. On this occasion, I want to share with you what I experienced while I was a watchman at one of the oldest cemeteries in this city. Although it might seem terrifying at first, just the idea of staying in a cemetery all night, initially, it was actually one of the most peaceful and convenient jobs I had. The administration of the place had hired our company's services, but they had their own watchman, a man over 80 years old who had been part of their maintenance staff since he was a young man. He refused to retire because his work was the only thing that motivated him at a stage in his life where he was already alone, having had no children and losing his wife a few years back. Although he could no longer perform all the maintenance tasks, they decided to place him as a permanent watchman, but always with a security guard to handle the rounds. When I met him, I understood why it was impossible to take away his job. Besides being the most dedicated person in the world, he was extremely friendly, one of those people you can't help but like once you get to know them. With me, for example, he insisted on doing some of the rounds so I could get ahead on my tasks. I think it was on my first day when I asked him if he had ever experienced anything strange there in the cemetery. He just laughed heartily as if the answer was obvious and said, "You'll have your turn." And indeed I did. I had only been there a few days when we had a night with terrible cold. We both went into the small cabin, made some coffee, and nearly fell asleep between the rounds from 3 to 4. And without realizing it, I had already fallen asleep. At one point we stopped and somehow they made me open my eyes. In front of me was an old monitor split into 4, showing us a rotation of images from 8 cameras. At the cemetery entrance, on the street side, 3 monks passed by with their hands in front, as if each was carrying something. I felt my face flush and I turned to Don Silver, who was watching the monitor attentively but without reacting. "What was that?" I asked, very agitated. "I don't know, go check it out," he said before bursting into laughter. I knew there was no point in continuing to ask about it, so I poured myself another cup of coffee to finish some pending tasks. Anything to erase that strange image from my mind. There are some very strange people in the world, I thought. Days passed, and anyone who tells you that a cemetery at night is nothing to be afraid of is either lying or hasn't been to the right cemeteries. On one occasion, Don Silver and I spent over an hour searching the entire place for the source of a girl's crying that seemed to be about 10 meters from us. We searched everywhere from one end to the other and never saw anyone. Yet the crying never moved away from us. In that place, I began to believe in all these paranormal matters. I started reading about it, and perhaps it opened my perspective a bit because, as a result, I began to experience more intense things. Seeing the monks pass by at dawn on the sidewalk next to the door became almost routine. The strange thing was that on that street, there were hardly any people walking once it started getting dark. It wasn't a residential area, and by night, our voices were the only ones heard for blocks around. You could say I had even gotten used to those apparitions until something different happened. Something that still scares me to remember. Don Silver was making his rounds when he started calling Gamby, the dog that always accompanied us. A boxer that seemed to be the same age in dog years as his owner. For some reason he wandered off, which was quite unusual for him. Don Silver's increasingly worried calls made me leave the tasks I was working on and get up to help in the search. As I passed by the monitor, I couldn't help but look at the camera at the entrance just 3 meters from us. Standing in front of the gate, the 3 monks seemed to be trying to open the door to get in. When I saw one of them could slightly open the iron gate despite the chains, I shouted to my companion and ran to the gate to push it and keep it closed. I couldn't see anyone, but I'm sure I felt a slight push when I held the door. Yes, I know someone pushed it. Don Silver, pale, helped me and we reinforced the door with another large chain. Almost at dawn we found Gamby hiding deep within the cemetery. If anyone wonders why I didn't take a photo or something similar, let me first say that when you encounter something like this, taking photos to prove it isn't something that crosses your mind. Secondly, this happened about 15 years ago when we didn't all have a camera in our pocket included in our cell phone. But my experience in this cemetery doesn't end here. I was almost 3 months into the job. My vacation was coming up, and I knew that upon returning, I would be assigned to another post. Although I would miss Don Silver, I was glad not to have to stay there 6 nights a week. I thought I could visit him any other day. After what happened that night, I never went back. It was very cold and the wind was blowing in a macabre manner. I felt that something was about to happen. But I attributed it to the eagerness to finally finish that shift and go on vacation to visit my family. Even the rounds to the eeriest corners of the cemetery were done with renewed spirit, knowing they were the last. I was in the midst of this when Gamby's agitated barking near the cabin caught my attention. I ran over and found the main door wide open. I hurried to close it. Gamby barked desperately behind me. As best as I could, I put the second chain with the old lock, even though only Don Silver had the key. When I turned around, I noticed the dog was barking inside the cemetery, not towards the street. He was barking frantically towards the main path that disappeared into the darkness just a few meters away. And it was there that I thought I saw shadows moving in the distance, approaching. From where I stood, I looked at the surveillance monitor inside the cabin, and my soul left my body at what I saw. 3 monks were approaching us from the depths of the cemetery, walking along the main path. Another 3 monks were approaching from the street side to enter through the door I had just closed, which was behind me. I picked up Gamby and managed to get into the cabin. I closed the door, turned my back to the monitor, and called my central office by radio, reporting the presence of strangers inside the cemetery. I didn't want to look at the monitor or the window. I reacted, coming out of the shock perhaps minutes later when my supervisor's patrol car arrived almost simultaneously with a police patrol. It took me a few minutes to break the chain I had just put on. I explained the situation, that I was unaware of Don Silver's whereabouts, and that I saw a group of young people with an antisocial appearance. Not for a moment did I hesitate to tell them that lie. I wasn't willing to say that ghostly-looking monks had slipped past my watch. Shortly after, it was time to leave, and later, around 8 in the morning, I was informed that Don Silver was at home, safe and sound. They didn't explain why he had disappeared from the place, but they told me he had asked to speak with me, something I postponed. 2 months later, still delaying that visit, one of my colleagues told me that Don Silver had just passed away. The only time I had to go back there, to that cemetery since then, was about 2 years later. I happened to see Gamby lying next to the main gate. Apparently, after Don Silver's death, the cemetery took him in. The things that dog must have experienced. Thank you for listening, and I hope to have another opportunity to share with you another of my experiences.